The sun set low, casting a golden hue over the neatly arranged chairs and floral arrangements that lined the garden. Everyone said the wedding was perfect, the kind of day every couple dreams about. Standing beneath the decorated arbor, I held her hand, gazing into her eyes, as I vowed to cherish her forever. She was everything I ever wanted. Radiant, kind-hearted, and endlessly captivating. But what I didn't know, as I slipped the ring onto her finger, was that the threads of betrayal were already woven into the fabric of our union. The night before our wedding had been like a whirlwind. Friends and family gathered for the rehearsal dinner. Laughter and toasts filled the air. My brother, Evan, as my best man, gave a speech so heartfelt it left a lump in my throat. I'd always looked up to him. He was my first protector, my greatest confidant. Later that evening, as tradition demanded, we parted ways until the ceremony. She stayed with her bridal party, while I retreated to Evan's place for a quiet night of reflection. Or at least, that's what I believed. If only I had known what really happened that night. What my wife-to-be and my brother shared when they thought the world wasn't watching. Even in those early days, I sometimes caught strange looks between the two of them. At first, I brushed them off as nothing more than friendly camaraderie. I was blinded by love, and the thought of deception never crossed my mind. As I lay in Evan's guest room that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't have imagined how deeply betrayal would come to carve its way into my life. The wedding morning began like a dream. The house buzzed with excitement. Bridesmaids flitted about with makeup brushes, and groomsmen cracked jokes over coffee. Yet, something felt slightly off with Evan. He wasn't his usual buoyant self. Just nerves, I thought. After all, being the best man came with its own set of pressures. I didn't dwell on it. I was too preoccupied with the enormity of what the day symbolized. A lifetime with the woman I loved. But while I waited for the ceremony to start, Evan pulled me aside. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Hesitation? I laughed, brushing off his odd demeanor. "Of course. I've never been more sure of anything." He smiled back, though it didn't reach his eyes. I chalked it up to him overthinking the best man speech he was about to deliver. What I didn't know then was how much weight his question carried. I didn't know that just hours earlier, my wife-to-be had stood in his arms, making choices that should have ended everything before it began. The night before the wedding, after the rehearsal dinner ended, she stayed behind with her bridal party to unwind. At least, that's what she told me. And for a while, that's exactly what happened. But as the night wore on and guests thinned out, Evan appeared. He was supposed to have left with me but claimed he'd forgotten something. They'd always had an ease about them. A natural chemistry that people mistook for sibling-like closeness. But in the quiet hours of that night, with the weight of commitment pressing down on her, she made a choice she would carry into our marriage like a shadow. Later, she would tell herself it was just a moment of weakness, a way to say goodbye to her old life. But as they kissed, their shared secret became a weight, growing heavier with each passing day. The ceremony was breathtaking, a memory painted in gold and ivory. She walked down the aisle, her dress shimmering in the late afternoon sunlight, her smile radiant enough to make me forget the world around us. For that moment, it felt like time stood still. Whatever nervousness I'd sensed in Evan earlier had vanished. He stood beside me, his usual confident self, and the moment felt perfect. We exchanged vows that echoed our promises to love and cherish one another for eternity. As her voice trembled with emotion, I felt a swell of pride and love that made every doubt, every worry, fade. When the officiant declared us husband and wife, I kissed her with all the hope of a man stepping into his greatest adventure. The reception was a blur of laughter, music, and stolen glances between us. We danced to At Last by Etta James, her head resting on my shoulder as the world melted away. Friends and family toasted to our happiness, their words blending into a cacophony of well-wishes. Even Evan, in his best man speech, managed to draw laughs and a few tears as he recounted stories from our childhood. Looking back, there were moments that should have stood out. The way her smile faltered when she locked eyes with Evan across the room, or the way he avoided her gaze entirely. The way she clutched my arm tighter whenever he came near. as if trying to overcompensate. But in the glow of the evening, those tiny signals dissolved into the background noise of a perfect wedding day. That night, as we retreated to our honeymoon suite, I was blissfully unaware of the betrayal that had unfolded mere hours before. I was too busy being swept up in the euphoria of a love I thought was unbreakable. But secrets have a way of festering. They don't stay buried forever. The first few months of marriage were everything I dreamed of. We settled into our routines, spent lazy Sundays making breakfast together, and whispered dreams of our future late into the night. Her laughter filled the spaces of our new home, and I told myself I was the luckiest man alive. But every now and then, I noticed her growing distant. She'd stare out the window during quiet moments, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. I'd ask if something was bothering her, but she always brushed it off with a soft smile. "Just tired," she'd say. Evan, too, became a more frequent presence in our lives than I expected. He would stop by unannounced, bringing beers or inviting me out for spontaneous brotherly hangouts. I appreciated the effort, though I sometimes wondered if he didn't trust me to balance marriage and our bond. Little did I know, his visits had less to do with me and more to do with keeping up appearances. One evening, as we were hosting a small dinner with close friends, I caught an odd exchange between them. I was clearing dishes from the table when I glanced back to see her and Evan locked in a tense, whispered conversation. When I walked back into the room, their heads snapped apart and she fumbled for her wine glass. Evan quickly excused himself, claiming an early morning meeting. Later that night, I asked her about it. "What were you and Evan talking about?" I asked casually, leaning against the bedroom door frame. She didn't look up from removing her earrings. "Nothing important," she said, a little too quickly. "Just catching up." There was something in her tone that made my chest tighten, but I didn't press further. I trusted her. She was my wife, the woman I'd vowed to stand by for the rest of my life. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who let paranoia get the best of him. Yet, the seeds of doubt had been planted, even if I didn't fully understand it at the time. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was overanalyzing things because I couldn't bear the thought of losing the perfect picture we'd built together. But the cracks were there, even if I couldn't see them yet. And soon, they would grow too large to ignore. Life pressed on, but those small, nagging doubts lingered in the back of my mind. I tried to dismiss them, chalking it up to the usual adjustments of married life. Yet, no matter how much I pushed them aside, they found ways to resurface. One evening, while scrolling through photos on my phone, I came across a picture from our wedding. It was a candid shot taken during the reception, capturing her laughing with Evan by the bar. There was nothing overtly strange about it, but something about the way they leaned into each other seemed too familiar, too comfortable. I stared at the photo for a long time, wondering if I was reading into something that wasn't there. A few weeks later, I was organizing a cabinet in the living room when I stumbled upon a small, gift-wrapped box tucked behind some old books. It wasn't my birthday or any other special occasion, so my curiosity was piqued. "Hey, what's this?" I asked, holding it up as she walked into the room. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she laughed nervously. "Oh, that? It's, something for you. I just hadn't decided when to give it to you yet." I grinned, eager to open it. "Why not now?" "No," she said, a little too sharply. Her face softened immediately, and she tried to laugh it off. "I mean, it's not finished yet. Just wait, okay?" I shrugged, not thinking much of it, but her reaction stayed with me. It wasn't the kind of nervous excitement you'd expect from someone planning a surprise. It felt more like the panic of someone caught off guard. Small things like that started adding up. Late-night texts that she claimed were from her best friend. Excuses to stay out late with coworkers I'd never heard of before. A sudden wariness about letting me borrow her phone. Each time, I dismissed it, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But the weight of those moments began to build, like stones piling up in my chest. Then came the night that changed everything. We were at a family gathering at my parents' house, and she was in the kitchen, helping my mom. I found Evan in the den, nursing a drink and staring at the fireplace. "You've been quiet tonight," I said, sitting beside him. He glanced at me and forced a smile. "Just tired." It was the same excuse she always used, and hearing it from him sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment, I considered asking him if everything was okay, if there was something he wanted to tell me, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to voice my fears, not to him. Instead, I let the silence hang between us, a quiet tension that felt more oppressive than the loudest argument. I didn't know it then, but that night marked the beginning of the end. The shadows in my mind were growing darker, and soon, they would consume everything. I became obsessed with piecing together the puzzle. Every glance, every interaction between her and Evan replayed in my mind like a looping tape, each time revealing something I hadn't noticed before. The way she would stiffen when his name came up in conversation. How they avoided being in the same room alone, but their eyes always seemed to find each other in a crowd. One night, after she'd fallen asleep, I found myself scrolling through her social media, looking for something. A clue, a hint, anything to confirm or dispel the gnawing unease in my chest. But her accounts were pristine, a curated gallery of happy moments. There was no trace of deception, no sign that anything was amiss. Still, the weight of my suspicions grew heavier. I began noticing small gaps in her stories. She'd tell me she was meeting her friends for dinner, only for me to find out later that one of them had been out of town that night. She claimed she was working late, but her car wasn't in the office parking lot when I drove by. I told myself I was being paranoid, that love required trust, and that my fears were nothing more than figments of my overactive imagination. But a part of me knew better. A part of me knew I was too afraid to confront the truth. Then came the phone call that shifted everything. It was late one night when Evan called, his voice unsteady. "I need to talk to you," he said, his words slurring slightly. "Can we meet somewhere?" I hesitated. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," he said quickly. Too quickly. I need to talk to you. Alone." A knot formed in my stomach, but I agreed to meet him at a nearby bar. When I arrived, he was already there, nursing a half-empty glass of whiskey. He looked disheveled, his usually confident demeanor replaced with an unfamiliar unease. "What's going on?" I asked as I slid into the seat across from him. He stared at his drink for a long moment before meeting my eyes. "Nothing. Forget it." "Evan." "Forget it," he snapped, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. Then, as if realizing his outburst, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I've been thinking about things. About us. About family." His words were a jumbled mess, and I couldn't make sense of them. But there was something in his eyes. Guilt, maybe? Regret? I couldn't tell. The conversation went nowhere. He left abruptly, leaving me with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Whatever he was holding back, it wasn't small. And it wasn't harmless. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were there, scattered and incomplete, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was closing in on something that would shatter everything I thought I knew. The days that followed Evan's strange phone call felt suffocating. Every interaction with him, or her, seemed to carry an undercurrent of unspoken tension, a ticking clock that only I seemed to hear. I couldn't shake the sense that something monumental was waiting to be unearthed, something that would either validate my fears or make me feel like a paranoid fool. Then, one evening, she came home later than usual. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to watch TV, but my mind was elsewhere. She walked in, her smile a little too bright, her voice overly casual as she kissed me on the cheek and asked how my day had been. "You're late," I said, trying to keep my tone even. She hesitated. "Yeah, the girls wanted to grab a quick drink after dinner." It ran longer than I expected. Something about the way she said it set my teeth on edge. "Which girls?" I asked, feigning nonchalance. She blinked, caught off guard. Sarah and Leah." "Why?" "No reason," I said, shrugging. "Just curious." She smiled and turned to head upstairs, but the unease in my chest refused to subside. As soon as she was out of sight, I pulled out my phone and texted Sarah, one of her closest friends. "Hey, just wanted to say thanks for keeping her out so late tonight. She deserves a fun night with friends." "Sarah." "What?" "I haven't seen her in weeks." "Everything okay?" The blood drained from my face as I stared at the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. I didn't know what to say. The next day, I resolved to dig deeper. I knew it wasn't healthy, but I couldn't help myself. I needed answers. While she was in the shower, I unlocked her phone and began scrolling through her messages. Most of them seemed innocent enough, but then I noticed a thread with Evan. It was sparse, with only a few recent messages. Still, something about their tone unsettled me. Evan, you've been quiet. Her, it's just hard. He's been asking questions. Evan, we need to be careful. Her, I know. I stared at the words, my hands trembling. Every instinct told me to confront her right then and there, but I held back. This wasn't enough. If I confronted her now, she'd find a way to explain it away, and I'd be left doubting myself all over again. I needed undeniable proof. Over the next few days, I began piecing together a plan. I couldn't rely on chance encounters or vague messages anymore. If there was something happening between them, if my wife and my brother were betraying me, I needed to catch them in the act. And deep down, as much as I wanted to be wrong, a part of me already knew the truth. It was only a matter of time before it came to light. The moment came on a night I hadn't expected. I'd been methodical in my search for answers, biding my time and waiting for the right moment to act. But sometimes, fate has a way of forcing your hand. It was a quiet evening. She had told me she was meeting friends again, and Evan had mentioned he was working late. Something about the overlap felt too coincidental, and the gnawing in my gut wouldn't let me sit idle. I decided to follow her. I didn't have a solid plan, just the overwhelming need to confirm or dispel my suspicions once and for all. I kept a safe distance as her car weaved through the city, my heart pounding harder with each turn she took. She finally pulled into a small, inconspicuous motel parking lot. My stomach churned. I parked far enough away to remain unseen and watched as she stepped out of her car. Moments later, a second vehicle arrived, Evan's unmistakable SUV. The air felt like it had been sucked out of my lungs as I watched my brother get out of his car. He walked up to her without hesitation, his hand resting on her lower back as they disappeared into one of the rooms. I sat there, frozen, my mind refusing to process what I had just witnessed. The two people I loved most in the world, my wife and my brother, had shattered the very foundation of my life. My chest felt tight as I grabbed my phone and began recording. I needed proof. Proof for myself, proof to confront them, proof to ensure that they couldn't twist the truth. I waited, every second stretching into an eternity, until the door opened again. They walked out, their faces relaxed, completely unaware of the devastation they had just left in their wake. I kept recording until they parted ways, and then I drove home in a daze. When she walked through the door later that night, I was waiting for her. She looked startled to see me sitting in the dark, her keys jangling in her hand. "How was your night?" I asked, my voice steady, though every fiber of my being was trembling with rage. "It was fine," she replied, her smile faltering. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" I stood and walked over to her, holding up my phone. "Because I've been waiting for you to explain this." Her face turned ashen as she saw the video playing on the screen. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head as if trying to will the moment away. "It's not what it looks like," she whispered, her voice breaking. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed through the room. "You're going to stand there and lie to me after everything?" She sank to the floor, sobbing, as the weight of her betrayal hung between us like a storm cloud. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she had caused. But instead, I turned and walked away, her pleas following me as I left the room. I didn't sleep that night. The video replayed in my mind, a cruel reminder of the life I thought I had and the one I now faced. Revenge wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a necessity. The day after the revelation felt surreal. I walked through my morning routine in a haze, my mind replaying every moment of the previous night. Her sobbing pleas echoed in my ears, but they only fueled the anger simmering beneath my calm exterior. I didn't confront Evan right away. Not yet. He was too calculated, too good at talking his way out of things. If I faced him without a plan, He'd twist the situation, and I couldn't risk losing control of the narrative. Instead, I took a calculated approach. If they were willing to betray me, I would use their arrogance and deceit against them. I began by gathering more evidence. I went through her phone again, this time with a sharper eye. The messages with Evan, though sparse, were enough to confirm the timeline of their betrayal. I found an email exchange, coded in professional jargon, that hinted at their rendezvous. They had been careful, but not careful enough. Next, I reached out to a lawyer, discreetly setting up a meeting. I wanted to know my options, to ensure that when the time came, I wouldn't just sever ties. I would ensure they both paid for what they had done. I was prepared to make this as painful for them as they had made it for me. But my revenge wouldn't just be about divorce or legal proceedings. I needed something personal, something that would expose them for who they truly were. I thought about Evan's reputation, his carefully crafted image of the loyal brother, the reliable friend, and her, the loving wife who always seemed so perfect in the eyes of our family and friends. That facade would come crashing down, and I would be the one to light the match. The opportunity presented itself a week later, at a family gathering to celebrate our parents' anniversary. Everyone would be there, friends, extended family, colleagues. It was the perfect stage. I waited until everyone had settled in, the room alive with chatter and laughter. Evan and she were both there, acting as though nothing had happened, as though their betrayal wasn't hanging over us like a guillotine. My blood boiled every time I saw them exchange a glance, but I kept my composure. When the moment felt right, I stood and raised my glass. I just wanted to say a few words about family. I began, my voice steady, though my heart pounded in my chest. All eyes turned to me, their smiles warm and expectant. Family is everything, isn't it? I continued, locking eyes with Evan. His smile faltered slightly. It's trust, loyalty, love. It's knowing that the people closest to you have your back, no matter what. My gaze shifted to her. She looked pale, her eyes darting nervously between me and Evan. But sometimes, I said, pausing for effect, the people you trust most are the ones who hurt you the worst. The room fell silent. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I've always believed in honesty, I said, holding up the screen. So let me share some honesty with all of you. With the push of a button, the video I'd taken at the motel began playing on the large screen at the front of the room. Gasps filled the air as the footage unfolded, exposing their betrayal for everyone to see. The room erupted into chaos. Gasps of disbelief, whispers of shock, and the clinking of hastily set-down glasses filled the air. Evan's face turned a shade of crimson I'd never seen before, his confident demeanor crumbling under the weight of exposure. She, on the other hand, looked frozen, her hands trembling as she stared at the video playing for all to see. I kept my gaze steady, unwavering, as the truth unraveled before our family and friends. My parents' faces were a mix of confusion and horror, their eyes darting between Evan, her, and me. What the hell is this? Evan finally managed to stammer, standing abruptly. His attempt to feign outrage only deepened my anger. It's the truth, I said calmly, my voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The truth about you, about her, and about the kind of people you both are. She broke down first, tears streaming down her face as she tried to approach me. Please let me explain. Explain what? I snapped, my voice rising for the first time. That you lied? That you betrayed me with my own brother? What's there to explain? Evan stepped forward, hands raised in what I assumed was meant to be a placating gesture. Listen, we never meant for this to happen. Don't, I growled, pointing a finger at him. You don't get to play the victim here. You had a choice. Both of you did. And you chose to stab me in the back. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room was watching, waiting for what would happen next. I turned to my parents, who looked utterly devastated. I'm sorry you had to find out like this, I said, my voice softening, but I couldn't keep this secret any longer. My father shook his head, his face etched with disappointment. Evan, how could you? Evan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of his shame was evident, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. She tried to speak again, her voice choked with sobs. I made a mistake. No, I interrupted. A mistake is something you do once. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. Over and over again, you chose to betray me. I couldn't stay in the room any longer. Without another word, I walked out, leaving the stunned crowd behind. My phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages as I drove home, but I ignored them all. I needed space, clarity, and a way to move forward from the wreckage they had left behind. By the time I reached the house, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The fallout had just begun, and I wasn't done making them face the consequences of their actions. The days following the family gathering were a whirlwind of chaos. My phone didn't stop ringing. Friends, family, and even acquaintances calling to express their shock, offer condolences, or, in some cases, pry for gossip. I ignored most of them, focusing instead on what came next. She moved out that week. I didn't ask where she went, and I didn't care. Evan, too, had gone silent, likely retreating into the shadows as his reputation unraveled. Word spread quickly, and the fallout was swift. His colleagues distanced themselves, and mutual friends made it clear where their loyalties lay. For a man who prided himself on appearances, it was a bitter pill to swallow. I could have stopped there, let their shame and ruined reputations be enough. But I wasn't finished. They had taken everything from me. My trust, my love, my sense of stability. I wanted them to feel the same sense of loss, to understand the depth of the betrayal they had inflicted. First, I finalized the divorce proceedings. My lawyer, armed with the evidence I had collected, ensured that it was swift and decisive. She walked away with little more than the clothes she left with, her claims to anything more evaporating under the weight of her infidelity. Next, I turned my attention to Evan. His job was tied to our family's business, a position he'd taken for granted for far too long. I met with my father, laying everything out plainly. Evan's actions have jeopardized the family's reputation, I said, my tone firm but measured. I can't work alongside someone I can't trust. To my relief, my father agreed. Evan was quietly removed from the business, his responsibilities reassigned to someone more deserving. It wasn't a public spectacle, but I knew the loss would sting far more than the whispers of scandal ever could. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild my life. Therapy became a cornerstone of my recovery, helping me process the anger, grief, and betrayal that had consumed me. I poured myself into work, hobbies, and reconnecting with friends I had unintentionally distanced myself from during my marriage. And though it took time, I began to let go of the need for revenge. Their lives were already in ruins, and holding on to my hatred only tethered me to the pain they'd caused. One day, I ran into Evan at a local cafe. He looked like a shell of the man he once was, disheveled, weary, and entirely defeated. He tried to approach me, but I stopped him with a raised hand. "We have nothing to talk about," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "You made your choices. Now live with them." He nodded, his head hanging low as he turned and walked away. Watching him go, I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a sense of finality. As for her, I haven't seen or spoken to her since the day she left. I've heard rumors about failed relationships, attempts to reach out to old friends who want nothing to do with her, but they don't affect me. She's a part of my past now, a chapter I've closed for good. In the end, I realized that the best revenge wasn't ruining their lives. It was reclaiming my own. I started traveling, taking trips I'd always dreamed of but never prioritized. I surrounded myself with people who valued loyalty and honesty. And slowly but surely, I began to heal. The scars of their betrayal will always be there, faint reminders of a time when I lost everything. But they no longer define me. I am stronger, wiser, and freer than I ever thought possible. And that, I think, is the greatest revenge of all.